And I'm not sure if I was unmuted before, but I was giving you a little introduction. And so I might repeat myself slightly, but as you're filtering in, feel free to put your name if you have an organizational or other affiliation and where you are joining us from. Very hearty, warm welcome to you all. My name is Cass Gioze. I'm a watersheds program manager for Bonneville Environmental Foundation, and coming to you with you today through a special project in collaboration with many partners called Treeline. And Treeline is funded by the Climate Resilience Fund and seeks to bring together nursery partners, restoration practitioners, and researchers throughout the Pacific Northwest in conversation about climate adaptation, assisted migration of plant materials, and native plants, woody plants in particular, trees and shrubs. This conversation in today was inspired by a webinar conversation, or rather a group convening of the Forest Adaptation Network, convened by Rowan Braybook and Michael Yadrick. That's a kind of a Puget Sound group that has similar discussions. Georgia Mitchell, who's with us today, gave a great update on summer impacts of seed collection, and it inspired us to bring together seed collectors to have a conversation and share insights and information about climate change. Thank you. It's wonderful to see you all and your updates filtering in. I'm going to give you a very brief orientation and we're going to dive right in. And just so you know, this is being recorded. We'll send out that recording to you all after we're completed. And you're welcome to share that with colleagues and friends. And again, thank you for making time to join us today. My colleague Hannah Bueller and Kayla Seaforth are also playing a key role in supporting today's webinar, and thanks to them, you might see them put some notes and links into the chat function. As we dig into the slides, Hannah will put some key links into that chat. We'll hold off until the introductions have kind of waned down. It can be hard to track chat in a webinar. We intentionally kept it as a Zoom instead of a anonymous webinar because you all are a huge part of why we are getting together. And it's fun for you to see each other, for us to see you, ideally with mute buttons on as possible. If and as you have questions, you're welcome to put them in chat. We're hoping that there's time at the end for questions. Kayla will be monitoring that chat and she can pull out key questions if that makes sense in the conversation. But we're going to have a fairly open, somewhat flexible conversation today. And Hannah, would you advance the slide once, please, when you have a minute and you're able?
Sorry, one sec.
No problem. And I know too that Hannah's doing a few things and juggling roles. And so thank you for that. So as we dig in, one more, please, Hannah. We're going to take a little bit of time and ask our speakers to give an introduction to themselves. And I'll kind of walk folks through so they're not wondering who's on point when. Hannah is going to pin the speakers when she's able so you can see them all. And we have an amazing lineup of seasoned and more early career seed collectors. What's special about bringing seed collectors together is it's something of a solitary job. And so to have these really notable individuals together in conversation is special for all of us. It's also special for them. And so it's been a pleasure to coordinate this and to get to touch points with these people. And we're just very excited to welcome everyone. So as soon as the pinning is possible, we'll get right started. And I think I tasked Hannah with too much, and apologies about that. It's great to see your names again. And I'll just say a few more words about the speakers and today, and then we'll dig right in. So essentially, we've gathered together folks from as far south geographically as Chico, California, that's Kral, Jackovich, and as far north as Georgia and Forrests, who are in, I believe, Port Angeles and Bellingham. George and John and Sophie are all based in the Willamette Basin in Oregon, but seed collectors play many different roles. We have folks here with us today who do everything from tree climbing for conifer seed collection to native forb collection, and of course, woody plant seeds for trees and shrubs. Hannah, where are we at with pinning? And then we can dive right in.
They should all be pinned.
Oh,
if anyone
good.
can't see the speakers, let me know.
Okay, perfect. So sorry if I was stalling for too long. Let's dive right in. And Georgia, can you tell us your name, a little bit about your work, how long you've been seed collecting, and any story or acknowledgement of a mentor, teacher, or advisor to you in your seed collection experiences? And we'll ask the same questions of all the speakers.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I think you should be able to hear me.
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, so I'm Georgia Mitchell. I've been with Fourth Corner Nurseries since 2015. In 2018, I trained with Rich Hard, who had been developing the native plant collection, seed collection program here at Fourth Corner for about the last 30 years. So as he was transitioning into retirement, I got about 7 months of training. And then I've been leading the wild seed collection program since. So 2021 was my 4th year on the job in that department. My focus is primarily deciduous woody trees and shrubs. And the range is regularly about 4 to 5 counties in Northwest Washington. We make an average of 5 trips to Eastern Washington each season, and an occasional foray down into Southwest Washington and or the Willamette Valley. So that's our range. We also collect a smaller list of perennials and graminoids, and then an occasional wild aquatic collection or something here or there. We're working on Thuja plicata being our kind of token in-house conifer collection, but we also rely on outside collectors and a little bit of on-farm seed production. So yeah, in terms of important mentor relationships, I learned about Fourth Corner Nurseries and Richard Hard's work back when I was finishing college at Western. And so I decided I wanted to work with him several years back. So that time I spent training was really a really sweet and special time to get his download, all those hours driving around in the truck together. And I was also thinking back to my college years and the other people I was inspired by at that time. And there was an ethnobotanist, Gary Paul Nabin, and his books, Cultures of Habitat and Growing Food in a Hotter, Drier Land, that really inspired me. And I was also inspired by Masanobu Fukuoka's Sowing Seeds in the Desert. So I think my interest in seeds and climate change really comes from that time.
Beautiful. Thank you, Georgia. George, can we turn it over to you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you sound great.
Great. Hey, Cass. Hey, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. So currently, my wife and I manage Scholls Valley Native Nursery. We're a little native plant nursery here in the northern Willamette Valley. This is one in a kind of a long string of things that I've done in my career, which goes back almost 40 years now, actually, in managing natural resources. And I've done everything from climbing Douglas firs to crawling around on my hands and knees looking for Brodia seeds in the midst of a stand of grass, which if anyone has done it kind of knows what I'm talking about. And one of the memories actually that came up in the process of thinking about this little intro was actually last June. I assume most of you all experienced the heat dome event. Just a day before that thing really hit, I was actually scouting around in the top of Doug fir trees. It was a really fascinating experience to see how quickly things changed. Anyway, let's see, other questions. My mentors, one of them, one of my favorite mentors and collaborators is here right now. And his name is John Anderson. We'll hear more from John later, but I've really enjoyed my time with John. Just a fabulous person. I have to mention my dad. My dad is a botanist and has botanized all over North America and a good swath of Central and South America. And growing up with him was kind of an incomparable experience in all kinds of ways. I'm going to mention one other person who some of you may know. I hope some of you know. And he's a person that might not come to mind because his work has been instrumental in the annihilation of millions of native trees and shrubs. His name is Mike Newton, and he's a silviculture professor and researcher at Oregon State University, and one of the greatest minds that I know. And the reason I wanted to bring him up is because he's a person from a very different perspective. And if we're going to be successful going forward, we're going to have to find a way to engage with a variety of perspectives. But there's no person that I know on this planet who knows the forests of the Northwest better than Mike Newton. So I thought he's worth mentioning. So anyway, that's me.
Beautiful. Thank you, George. And I don't know if you mentioned this, but Mike Newton is a professor at Oregon State University in the College of Forestry. And he is absolutely one of my favorite people to speak with and get a hug from. He has got a heart of gold, and I thank you for that, George. We'll turn it over right to you, John, one of the teachers of George. And
hear me now?
yes.
Okay. So actually I met George as we wandered around. So he didn't mention he just completed his PhD. At least I think you finished it because you did your defense. Yeah. So he's did a fantastic job, and we spent a lot of hours driving around looking at white alder and red alder together. He mentioned his wife, so I want to mention mine because I saw the date on the event said January 18th, and today's the 19th. But I recognize the 18th because yesterday was our 47th wedding anniversary, and she's been kind of a seed widow during the summer, so I just wanted to mention her. For a mentor, I grew up on a date farm in Southern California. My family started farming there 100 years ago last year, and my grandmother knew all the different wildflowers, so I think she was probably the mentor that got me excited about seeds and plants. And my wife used to own Seven Oaks Native Nursery. We got involved in that in 1991. And then I started doing seeds in 2006 when I sold it to Mike and Scott. And when I needed a name for my new business, my brother said, "Hey, Johnny, when you were a little kid, we called you Johnny Variety Seed because you were always collecting seeds." So I think it's just innate in me, loving seeds. And I worked in Haiti also, working in reforestation there. So got a long background in all kinds of seed stuff.
And John, the geography that you collect in?
I collect mostly in the Pacific Northwest, over at the coast and over in Central Oregon. But I also collect a lot of seed down in Southern California when I go down to visit my family. And I should mention that I'm just in the process of selling my business. Emily Whitcomb is in one of the group here, and she's going to be taking over starting February 1st.
Wow, great. Thank you, John. Forrest?
Thank you. I'm really glad to see names of friends that I haven't seen for many years, both in the Northwest and across the country, going through the chat. And I'm located in Port Townsend, Washington, on the edge of the Salish Sea on the Olympic Peninsula, the ancestral territories of the Makah, Sklallam, and Chimicum peoples. And I'll return to that theme a little bit later. So my business is called Inside Passage Seeds, and that reflects the theoretical harvest area that is roughly Olympia, Washington to Gustavus, Alaska, Glacier Bay. In practical terms right now, because of the closure of the Canadian border, things have gotten a little more constricted. We might come back to that later too. I've been a full-time seedsman. This is actually my 50th year. I started full-time in 1973 and have not looked back. I've been on the Olympic Peninsula since 1977 and have my, haunts that I go to every year for collections, ranging across Puget Sound region and beyond, formerly into Canada, hopefully in the future. And I have a network of collectors around the region and in Alaska and in Oregon who, provide individual species. So some historical figures in my own past. It's been an interesting journey. I'm just going to mention in the first few years. So the way I came into this work was I was a grad student at UC Berkeley, and I decided to take a leave of absence because right next, almost across the street from our campus was the beginning of People's Park. If you're not familiar with that, then I suggest Google it after this meeting. That was in April 1969, and it really marks the kickoff of the environmental movement in North America. The short version was that after some weeks of turmoil in Berkeley, as you could imagine, berserkly, we had a large teach-in with thousands of people, and the last speaker was Gary Snyder, the well-known North American poet who's now in his 90s. And he pointed me in the direction that guided my work ever since then. Learning the plants. Within a couple of years, I knew maybe 300 species. And then after People's Park, we started what was called People's Park Annex. And a nice Quaker lady who was about 64 at that time came and fetched about 4 of us. And she said, I'm going to teach you how to garden. So she would come once a week, take us out to her little suburban homestead and guide us in gardening and all the home economics, like canning and drying and things like that. And one day she showed me how to collect seeds. So I was initiated at that point, and that was such a blessing. Then after Lucy Hupp, then I moved to the Northwest, settled in Seattle for a while, and I started a business called Abundant Life Seeds. Some of you may know its successor, which was Abundant Life Seed Foundation. I operated both as a for-profit and later as a nonprofit until 1992, when I handed it off to others and started my current business, Inside Passage Seeds, focusing exclusively on natives, which includes not only woody species, but herbaceous, also grasses, pretty much the spectrum of things that bear seeds. I try to collect up to 150 to 200 species a year and in cooperation with my networks. Another guide for me was after I started to get some of my skills together in the early 70s, I became acquainted with Dr. Gerard Vreeburg, who was the curator of the medicinal plant garden at the University of Washington, Seattle campus. And even though I was not a student, we bonded, and he gave me some really important skills, and I'm indebted to him. And then lastly, I'll mention my dear elder friend named Bryn Bjors, who lived on the shore of Puget Sound for many years. He was a scientist. And when I started the nonprofit foundation, he immediately reached in his pocket, handed me a $10 bill, and he said, "This will succeed." So I thought that was more important than anything that happened after that, because even though it was a small gesture, it was an affirmation saying, "You're on the right track and I support you." So I try to be that person for others now. Lastly, my current work has expanded into focus on prairies for about 25 years. I won't try to define prairie right now, but We started a nonprofit in 2018 called Olympic Peninsula Prairies, and our work is to identify historic prairie locations, attempt to restore the ones that are still intact, and now we're starting to experiment with starting prairies from scratch. That's very challenging, but at least we have locations on historic prairies, even though they're obliterated. We think the soil is right and the climate is right, and we'll reintroduce the plants and seeds and see if we can, reboot the prairie process. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Forrest. Sophie?
Yeah, thank you for that, Forrest, as well. I grew up actually in Berkeley, so it's funny and lovely to hear that mentioned again. So I'm Sophie Linden. I work for the Institute for Applied Ecology. I'm the plant materials technician, and I've been working for IAE for just under a year. As an organization, IAE collects mainly species within the Willamette Valley and the coastal lowlands of Oregon, primarily forbs and grasses, and primarily workhorse species, as well as some T&E species that we collaborate with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And as well, it should be mentioned that both our Corvallis office and then our Southwest office together, IAE helps coordinate 3 native seed networks. So in terms of mentors, teachers, and guides in my work, one of them has already been mentioned by John, Emily Whitcomb, who I hope is in the room. So Emily was the plant materials technician before me and had worked for IAE for 5 years. And I feel utterly grateful for her. And she was so generous in introducing me not only to the work at IAE in terms of protocols and procedures and such, but I'd say that as I'm listening to everyone else in the room and also just reflecting on my own experience, what it means to have time with sites and the kind of inherited knowledge that is a part of that, even within the time span of 5 years, and the intuition that's gained from that is exceptional and profound, and there should be always more opportunities for contributions in that way. I'd also say there's a ecological restoration designer in Portland, Melissa Melko, who I've collaborated with, and she has her own micro nursery in Portland and has her own seed CSA. And whether or not she's in the room too, has been a really great collaborator in terms of thinking about genetic diversity and the pooling of genetic diversity on so many scales and in so many places. How there is continuity between the urban watershed and the acreage and the restoration site, and that is the goal, and it takes a constellation of many organizations in order to get there. And then lastly, I'll just say that, as someone who's early in her career, I'm in awe of the fact that seed collection is something that many species and many peoples across the world have practiced, both in present time and a deep time that is greater than my lifetime will be. And I think as someone who is starting out in her career, always just in gratitude of my great-grandmother, who I may not even have many stories of, but it was a seed collector for her own, sustenance, and also the stories and practices of many folks who are constantly recentering the conversation around seed collection. And there's the excitement in that of ever, just feeling grateful and excited for the time to come.
Thank you, Sophie. And last but not least, Kral.
Okay. Hi, thank you very much for asking me to join you guys. And I started collecting seeds in 1980. I did arborist work, and I was doing a thinning project in Concow, California, and the foresters asked me to collect ponderosa pine all around my house. And I did really well at that and was real interested in not running chainsaws thinning, and started pursuing different avenues, contacting professors and researchers, and ended up getting collection projects working with the whole range of cypress throughout California, from Mexico up to Redding. And that I was with Connie Millar, and worked with Bill Dvorak from Camcor doing Monterey pine for genetic conservation, and Deb Rogers doing the Monterey pine on the islands off of Mexico. And yeah, just kept getting more and more requests and working with the LA Moran Reforestation Center. Lori Lippett was the manager then. And there was a big program in the 80s, climbed lots of giant sequoias and coast redwood, most all the conifers in the Sierras. And I got opportunities to work in Chile on rare conifers, and lots of collections in Mexico on saltgrass, and in Chihuahua and Oaxaca with Zsolt Debrecki, a Hungarian tree expert. So been pretty fortunate to be able to go all over the place and collect seeds and do trainings. And yeah, I'm still doing it. And this last year we had our biggest redwood collection, collected over 1 million redwood cones and got approximately 100 million seeds. So still going along pretty well. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. We're going to take a moment and turn the mic to Georgia, who is going to share a couple of insights from some research. Hannah, if you could share the slides one more time. Georgia, can you share a little bit of reflections about these slides and what they mean for the conversation today?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to kick us off by sharing some research that was done by Mariah Crowley, who recently graduated from the Huxley School of the Environment at Western Washington University. So I had the opportunity to work with her on her senior project, which was quite fun and exciting. And she really did all the heavy lifting. She just took my ideas and ran with them. And we've linked her full report here at that lower left link as a Google Doc. So you can look at that at some point, but I'll just kind of hit the highlights. Our research question was really about whether by analyzing some phenological data for native plant species, we could see any trends that might indicate the current effects of climate change on species life cycles as those relate to wild seed production going forward. So Mariah was able to extract what amounted to a random sample of bloom dates from the Burke Herbarium Image Collection website. And so by pulling those bloom dates and then doing the data analysis, the time span was 1972 to 2021. So you can see on the right side of the graph, the purple color is like the dates in the 1970s going up to the red and brown colors and more the present day. And so what data analysis showed is that the average bloom date for Rosa Nutkana has shifted 18 days or 18 days in the last 50 years. So this research doesn't directly link that shift to climate change, but it certainly makes me wonder whether that's the primary driver of what we're seeing here. Next slide, please.
Are you able to see the next slide, Georgia?
No, I didn't see it move. There we go. Yeah, we're good. So the second piece that we did is that I exported seed collection data from Fourth Corner Nurseries archives from 1999 to 2020. And so Mariah ran the data analysis on that. And there we got a bit of a surprise that our average seed collection date has actually regressed about 17 days in the last 20 years. So I'm now collecting seed later than Rich was back in the early 2000s. So again, we don't necessarily know that this is directly impacted by climate change, and exactly what the factors are that are causing these phenological events to shift in opposite directions. I have some thoughts on, or, just ideas, theories on what might be going on. But I think what it points to is if these effects are due to climate change, and then the impacts to native species may be highly species specific and, like in this case, somewhat unexpected. So I would really love to see this research continue. I mean, as an on the ground collector, I would love to be able to see the trends that are already happening in order to, have an idea of what to anticipate going further. So Mariah currently has all the raw data for a whole much larger list of species that I gave her. And if someone happens to have, a graduate research fellowship in their back pocket, and let us know, I'd really love to see this continue. Yeah, so that we can have, use the recent past as a bit of a guide going forward. Yeah, and kudos to Mariah for doing what her advisor said ended up being graduate level data analysis. So those were the main pieces I wanted to share.
Thank you, Georgia. And Hannah, yeah, thank you. Another piece, just to build on what Georgia just said, we were talking about this yesterday and why to share it today. We often think of imagine climate impacts as, again, making, changing flowering times, et cetera. But this erratic difference was surprising. And then the other piece was, this was one species. And what does this look like for others? It's each a unique case. And I wanted to ask George, George, would you share any reflections on what Georgia has just shared, or any other, thoughts from your research on this topic?
You don't want to get me started. I won't go too long, I promise. No, I'm fascinated by this. My research is, really centers on plant ranges and range dynamics. And certainly these phenologic impacts that we're seeing are going to be associated in one way or another with range dynamics. As we push species, one of the things that I'm really kind of diving into now is niche modeling and trying to make the most of what we now know about plant distributions and the incredible wealth of climate data that we have available to us to build models of not only what the climate is now that species that we might be interested in are experiencing, but also recreating the climates of the past, the recent past, and drawing inference from that about what might happen next. And some of that's quite interesting. I won't go into it because I don't want to take too much time, but it is, I'm fascinated with all of this. And there are important things that are clearly happening. We can see evidence of these changes, sort of maybe the ultimate outcome of massive phenologic shifts. In other words, plant decline and mortality. We're seeing these things very clearly in the Willamette Valley. So those of you who know this area, and I understand also up in the Puget Trough as well, declines in western red cedar, declines in western hemlock, declines in plants like Abies grandis and red alder. And there's some kind of commonality in these species that are now in decline in the Willamette Valley and the Puget Trough. They're part of a suite of species that that really make up the temperate forests of the Northwest. And seeing all of these tree species in decline should be telling us something. So absolutely, I think this is definitely the conversation that we need to be having right now. Because the question is, well, what comes next? Mm-hmm. Right? So.
Well, and that actually is a perfect segue into our next question, which we're going to ask each speaker to answer in a round robin fashion. So George, you had said, what are the stories that those trees tell us, those species tell us? And we just want to ask each person to think of, for those of you in a geography where the summer heat dome was a significant impact, or any other story really from your career where you are seeing an example of a story worth sharing around climate and the intersection impacts of extreme events on the species that you're collecting. So you can tweak this a little bit to your interest and your experience, but Forrest, can we kick it off with you?
Certainly. I'd like to start by saying I've kept a log of all of my harvests from 1974 onward. So I now, in this context, see the value of that database because I have the dates and locations of everything, typically between 150 and 200 collections per year for, what is that, 47 years, I guess. So a couple observations. Not every year has the same ripening times based on when spring arrives. In our location, the signs of spring can be quite diverse from like late February to early April from year to year. It really depends on when the cold weather comes. So for example, this year we had 10 days of snow, which ended last week. The ground is bare now. It's actually warming up, and I think we're going to have an early start this year. So that means early harvest times too. But the other corollary to that is as you get further into the season, I'd say around June or July, then things kind of balance out so that even though some spring things may have appeared in seed early, by summer, things are pretty much on their schedule. And I don't see a lot of divergence from that schedule in my own harvest. I use that as a guide for when I should go to different locations, and it's pretty much spot on. And another corollary to that is a lot of species are yielding seed for about, let's say, 1 week if they're herbaceous, and particularly ones that are explosive, like poppies, for example. But then many of the woody species are available for harvest for many weeks. They don't drop all their seed at once. So sometimes I make repeat visits. Some things I harvest 3 times at the same location because that's what they do. Example, Aquilegia formosa doesn't produce all of its seed ripe at the same time. So if it's convenient, I will go again and again. It's one of my favorite plants. So it's just, part of the joy of seed collecting.
Great. John?
As far as the heat dome, I was up hiking down in Northern California, so I was high in the mountains, thankfully. But we met one guy from Israel that was going to hike 60 miles in one day to try and beat the heat dome. So crazy. I actually, when I came back from that, I was looking for some Delphinium menziesii and some Mount Eddy lupin, and those plants completely blasted. They didn't produce seed at all this year. The heat just fried the plants. I'd never seen anything like that, which affected insects as well, because there's insects that particularly live on the lupin. So I'm curious what that did to the insects this year. I collect some Western redbud, Cercis orbiculata, and that I've raised the price on that because I noticed the insect damage is getting worse and worse on that. And it seemed it's just harder to get clean, good, viable seeds. And I'm curious if that's a factor of climate change.
Thank you. Sophie?
Yeah, definitely, because I was also working with Emily at the time, watching her reaction to some of the sites that she had been there and along for, longer than I had. I had my own reaction in terms of the way that phenology was moving quickly or the season was ending early. And then there's another aspect to having someone who has more acquaintance with those sites as well. IE also had a Burns crew out, or Burns, Oregon crew. And while, if you have like the polygon of the heat dome, I understand that that's kind of like very edge of, there is also issues with trying to find pure live seed or filled seed to the collection targets simply because of the chronic drought. And to me, that speaks also to the ways in which there are extreme weather events like the heat dome, and then they get compounded or in conversation with something that might be more chronic in terms of a climate change event or events or tendencies, what's to come. And I would also say, I'm guessing some folks that are in the meeting today went to the Native Plant Materials Conference last week that IAE hosted. And there was a partner from the Willamette Partnership. And the speaker gave this anecdotal statement that they quoted as anecdotal, wherein there was about 80% mortality of plants that I'm guessing were planted in the Willamette Valley during the heat dome. And granted, this is, again, I'm not trying to add scare quotes to a statistic that still needs to be ground truthed, but it definitely, to me at least, speaks to the way in which, even if I'm on the side of seed collection, that the growth and establishment of plants is like another part of this sphere and cycle that we're a part of. And it influences me to think about seed collection practices going forward and how we're going to be thinking about the full cycle process of this.
Thank you. Kral?
Yeah, I was down in the sequoias. We did a collection in the beginning of July, and there was a good crop in Whitaker Forest just adjacent to Sequoia National Park, and we were climbing those sequoias. And as you looked out through the forest, you could see where most of the pines and firs had all succumbed to the drought. So the sequoias in those areas are really doing well, and it's becoming more a predominant sequoia forest. And a few years back in the drought, the viability of the seeds was usually, after a little upgrade of the seeds, you can get maybe 35, 45%. But for the prolonged drought, the seeds were only producing about 25% germ. And that's a serotinous species. And how they do it is when a fire goes through, it burns all the duff down because it's such a small seed, heats the cones, and they drop on the forest floor. And that's how they get started, because if they drop down on all the duff, the root can't get down to the bare soil and grow. But during the heat dome, which I've asked a bunch of people about it that have been doing the seed collections before I started, and my friend Dave Dulitz said, like, he started in the early 70s. He said they always get them from squirrel cut cones, and there's barely any squirrels left. And and when that big heat came, it opened all the serotinous cones. And another friend was working in Yosemite and in Sequoia Park and said they were just raining down seeds. And nobody had ever seen or heard of that happening. Usually the seeds will only open if there's a fire, if there's a bunch of broken branches in the tree and some sunlight goes and opens those serotinous cones. So that's pretty significant, that first time anybody's ever heard of those serotinous cones opening from a heat wave. And then in the Torrey pines and the Coulter pines further south, they pretty much stopped, not totally, but 90% stopped all cone productions. They're just barely hanging on, and lots of insect damage, lots of mortality, and the fires. So huge, vast areas where it would be easy to do collections in the 80s and 90s. Now it's almost impossible. There's barely any trees left, and they have real low seed production, except for a few little spots with the younger trees, which seem to have more vitality and can still put out some cones. But it's looking a little grim down there. So that's what I've noticed.
Georgia?
Yeah, I felt like I had a little bit of a laundry list finishing this season. Yes, I was starting with one of our Eastern Washington collections that was delayed quite a bit because, it was, 115 or however many degrees over there, and I just didn't feel comfortable. I would have been sending my colleague over to do the collection, and it just didn't feel like I could do that. It was too dangerous in terms of heat stroke. So we were going, that would have been our Amelanchier and Serviceberry and Fribes Aureum Golden Currant collections. And our more southerly locations, like the plants were toast, the berries were all gone. My colleague was able to find an elevation band I think it was about 1,400 to 2,000 feet. So she was really thinking on her feet and like found the area where those, there were still berries on the bushes and she could do a collection. Our yields were definitely lower than the last couple of years, but I was really proud of her. This is my friend, Krista Rome, who's been working with me this last year, that she pulled that off. So, I mean, overall, we managed to make our collections. Yields were definitely lower. There was a big, again, not necessarily directly related to the heat dome or climate change, but one wonders, like Arthria plicata, we were making an attempt on that collection and there was just widespread insect outbreak. So, we ended up rerouting to Southwest Washington and pulled off some, but again, much reduced. Vine maple, I saw effects where the seed clusters that normally in mid-July, they would still, like, the seeds would be totally green. And, you cut them open and you get these little beautiful folded cotyledons inside that are all moist. And normally we start that collection like very end of July. And so mid-July this year, I started seeing all these seeds. I mean, it was a smattering of in the clusters that were totally dried down. And I was a little bit freaking out of like, I can't do the vine maple collection 2 weeks early. What's going on? But meanwhile, there would be other seeds in the cluster that still, looked perfectly normal. So when I cut those dried seeds, like there was no live cotyledon inside. It was just little nutlets. So my suspicion is that was a combination of the chronic drought, like Sophie mentioned, which when I looked back at our weather data this year, we really started having below average rainfall, like in March. So, by July, those plants had been suffering for a while. And I just wonder if, that seed didn't have the moisture it needed to develop properly. That was kind of my working theory. Yeah, we saw pretty also large scale like bleaching of seed in our graminoid fields, where it's just clearly non-viable. Actually, we pulled off a decent Carex of Nupta or sluice sedge wild collection this year, but some locations where it looked like totally non-viable seed, just got toasted, and then some collections would be okay. And I actually had trouble seeing a pattern. Like it wasn't necessarily intuitive to me, like why some places were okay and others that I thought actually would be better weren't. So yeah, the results are surprising right now.
George, I wanted to ask you if you would to reflect a little bit on Sophie's comment about seed collection is one thing and then plant establishment is another. Are there any items you're thinking about with respect to how you are collecting seed or where you are collecting seed or how you might go about planting differently, thinking ahead about climate change and those plant establishment challenges?
Well, as I'm sure all the speakers today know, I mean, these are huge questions, each one of them deserving their own webinar or seminar series or something like that. I was really interested in George's observation about the Carex of Nupta. And before I forget it, I wanted to mention that there's two things really that come to my mind. One is obviously that climate is highly variable at small scale, as most of you or all of you probably know. Another element is that there can be a lot of hidden population structure in these plants that we think of as species, and there can be a lot going on, and that may in some way contribute to those patterns that Georgia was mentioning. I think it's fascinating. I'm sorry, I've gotten myself completely distracted. Cass, would you please repeat your question to me?
I mean, you can speak about whatever comes to you, George, but if you had a thought in response to Sophie's observations and sharing about plant establishment and what
Oh.
that could mean for seed collection.
It's such an important topic. Yeah, Sophie, thank you for bringing that up. Obviously, we're collecting seeds for a reason. We're not just putting them on a shelf. Some of us might be, and there might be some value in that. But generally, most of the seed that's being collected is being used to propagate plants. And that's the reason for being, right? That's what we're doing here. This is a great opportunity to reflect on all of it, not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it. Why are we collecting seeds? Why are we propagating them in nurseries? And I think we need to start now looking at these things carefully and asking ourselves, are we achieving what are perhaps our unstated goals or not? So I think all of us are interested in diversity. We're interested in biodiversity and system function. IAE is an excellent example of an organization whose reason for being is exactly that. But we're talking about interactions with populations, and everything we do with these populations has an effect. And we are, in a way, sort of stepping in, and the reason, the thing that's sort of underneath what we're talking about here is, how do we intervene in a natural process, which is species moving across the landscape in response to changing climate? Well, I think we generally understand maybe this is different from climate change of the past. But we ought to be looking at climate change of the past and understanding it. If you look back at the history of the Pleistocene, there are a multitude of massive climate shifts that have occurred over the past million years. Tremendous swings in temperature that dwarf anything that we've seen within our lifetimes. And some of these happened quite rapidly. So I think one of the things we might want to consider is, well, what is the capacity of these populations to do this stuff on their own? Maybe this isn't their, as my advisor suggested, not their first rodeo. Plants have been around for, land plants have been around for hundreds of millions of years. They've seen a lot happen over that period of time. So it's a good opportunity to think about all of these things, and one of the things, and I'll stop there. You know, one of the things that my research revealed to me is the complexity of the patterns that are in the landscape. And so when we look at alder populations, for instance, in the Willamette Valley, and we can see, you know, red alder from one end of the Willamette Valley to the other, and we think, well, okay, this is a cohesive species. But within what appears to be a relatively homogeneous population, there is structure. And there are things happening at the molecular level that we can't see with our eyes, but they're there. It's like a painting, right? It's this painting that's been painted over time by the action of these species moving through the landscape. And it's quite an elegant thing. And in our work in collecting seeds and moving them around of our own kind of devices and for our own purposes is kind of irrespective of that. And I think one of the things that, you know, I'm mindful of is that these patterns that we can see now in the genetic landscape and I'd be happy to talk in more detail about what that looks like at the molecular level. But it's interesting to think that in 100 years, looking at the Willamette Valley, that things may be so confounded by our actions of moving seeds around that these patterns are no longer available for us to see. And that is of interest to me. I won't say it's, again, bad or good, but it's of interest. So I think it's something, I know there's two poles here. There's the group of people who think, no, we should not be moving seeds around at all. And there's other people who think, sure, let's move seeds around. We, you know, as humans have been moving seeds around our entire, you know, throughout civilization. But, and of course, the reality is we're doing it all the time. We're moving seeds everywhere, all over the place. So anyway, there's just a couple of thoughts. So I'd be curious to see what folks think of that.
Does anybody else want to comment on that, Carl?
Yeah, I think one thing about that is, like, well, I've heard
called like pollen pollution. Like you bring something in from somewhere else and it has all those characteristics and it might not do anything until it's putting out pollen, and then you don't necessarily have a hybrid, but you have this foreign pollen. It might be more drought tolerant, might not be, but it's definitely different, and it's creating a different strain, which may or may not be beneficial, but you're kind of getting a mutt population anytime you're bringing the same species in from a different area.
The process that works contrary to that is selection. And so for those of us who work with seed, one of the things that's worth thinking about is the number of seeds that each tree is capable of producing. And Kral, I know you know this, and working with those giant sequoias, and a wonderful example. I mean, how many seeds will a single mature giant sequoia produce in a season?
Well, they have multiple. We've gotten up to like 86 bushels of cones off of one tree, but it's not in one season because they're serotinous. Be multiple years. That's like a example of a really prolific tree, but that's just out of the top, and that'd be like about 8 or 9 million seeds just from the top of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
That's a extreme example, though. Lots of them don't make any seeds.
And over the lifespan of a tree like giant sequoia, we're talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions, maybe billions of seeds produced by a single tree, maybe. I guess the point is that,
yeah, with a mother tree, like some of the trees, if you see them, like in the late afternoon, they'll be, you can see some are more male with all the male cones, and then some are more female, and some just don't have any fun at all. They just sit there. They're more vegetative. So it depends on the individual, but they can make from just about nothing to bunches and bunches of seed, hundreds of millions. And then further inland in the sequoias where it's drier, there'll be more prolific seed productions. And like on the west slope, especially the younger trees, they'll be all vegetative. They know when it's time to make seeds. Like after the fires last year in 2 populations of the coast redwood, the trees are just, some trees had branches that were breaking from the amount of cone, like an apple tree. And a mile or 2 from the fire, 0 seeds. So they know when to make the seeds, that's for sure.
I'm curious, with both fires throughout the Pacific Northwest and West and new initiatives in revegetation, reforestation, what are folks seeing in terms of demand? And then we will move into kind of a segue about borders and boundaries. But can anyone speak to any recent observations about any shifts in seed demand?
Yeah. First, I want to just briefly mention, we're still collecting Slough sedge. It's the 3rd week of January. It holds on really well. And that has turned out to be the biggest demand item this year of my entire spectrum of collections. Second, the alder production. Well, locally here, we haven't seen a drop off in alder seed production. And I think that's because we don't have the extreme heat that possibly kills pollen. We did have record high temperatures, but I wouldn't say like, species destroying temperatures. So we have collected alder this year. It's been pretty good. And third, an example of one that was affected, and that's Mahoney and nervosa. But again, local is the word. So for example, in the Cascade foothills, we found that harvest areas that looked really good in the spring were completely blasted, and there was no harvest whatsoever. But locally, here on the peninsula, harvest was not bad. But that is a species that doesn't produce evenly each year. So there's peak years like last year, which was our best ever, and this year, which was one of the worst ever, mostly because of the consequences of that Cascade heat blast. But locally, I was still picking that into November. As far as other species, I mentioned earlier, I have this focus on prairie. So I'm getting a lot of interest in the upland grasses, which we don't wild harvest so much. We do a little bit, but mostly get those from production sites, mostly in the Willamette Valley. They all started from wild collections and then they were increased. But we also do all of our own harvests on these sedges. So maybe 15 different sedge species, and they're all wild harvested. So the key there is the wetland staying wet? If it dried up in the summer heat, then maybe, you know, there was no seed production or very little, but if it stayed wet, good production. And that's why we're still collecting Carex subnupta in January.
Kral, you had mentioned in a previous conversation just some comments about demand. And I'm curious if you could share a little bit about that with us and how that jives with what you're seeing in the field as you're collecting.
The demand for redwood seed has grown tremendously, but it's more abroad. In New Zealand, they're planting a lot, and huge orders in France and in Germany. So I imagine the climate's changing there to allow coast redwoods to grow well, and they're doing a bunch of giant sequoia there as well. So, and I guess in Oregon on the coast, I guess they got the Swiss needle cast hitting the Doug fir, so they're all dying. So a lot of people are transitioning, planting redwoods instead of the Doug fir. So they're moving a lot of redwood production up that way for the timber companies. Worth more and grows faster, so that a lot of that's profit driven.
Any other reflections on demand?
Not me.
We've had a number of comments, including some good ones from Ariana in the chat. And if I'm tracking it correctly, on the themes of elevational gradients, microclimates, which there's different scales of borders and boundaries. And we've talked about borders and boundaries in a few ways already. Forrest, can I kick it off with you to offer some reflections on how borders and boundaries manifest in your work as a seed collector?
Yeah, great question. Being on the peninsula, we have both our seaward side and then our inland water side, and found consistently that the ripening times on the coastal side are about 10 days later than they are on the Puget Sound side. So we can gradually move our harvest in a westward direction in the course of the harvest window for certain species. So if we miss them on one side, we still can catch up with them on the other side. Definitely elevation, but then, you know, some species don't range very far in elevation, especially the ones that are shoreline species, which are kind of a specialty that I really enjoy because I like being next to the ocean when I'm working. The other border issue that I mentioned earlier was the Canadian border. So I presently cannot go to Canada to do collections. And some of those collections were unique, like the only harvest site I knew was in Vancouver Island, let's say. I can't go there. Fortunately, I have collaborators in a lot of places, but it really is impinging as long as this shutdown, you know, continues. It's because I, you know, have unique knowledge of certain sites, and I'm just not going to try to tell somebody else where that is, mostly because it's too difficult to identify the exact location by, you know, email.
Anyone else want to offer any reflections on boundaries and borders? We have a good question from Glenn Ahrens with OSU Extension. And this kind of harkens back to the immediate question just now on shortages. And he's sharing from someone at American Forests, Brian Kittler, that they're just really seeing a significant gap in demand and a shortage on an order of magnitude scale. Kral, I think you referenced some of these shortages. Can you speak to any of the comments you're hearing in California around demand for especially conifer seeds, and how that is aligning with availability?
Well, with these huge fires, there's a huge demand for ponderosa pine. And let's see, there's always a demand for giant sequoia in very limited areas that they allow collections because they don't want you climbing in the parks. So that's always been a pretty good demand. But now that all those serotinous cones have opened, there's not really any seed available, barely. And there won't be until these trees put on multiple crops, unless people want to climb and collect just a single year crop, because they're void of closed cones now from that heat dome.
Anyone else have any thoughts to share on this one? And we can also move into additional questions of each other. In particular, Georgia and Sophie, you kind of represent the next generation of seed collectors. And I'm just curious to hear if you have reflections on how you can maybe build new relationships of mentorship, either with some of the folks who are here on speaking with you today, or just questions you're curious about and information you're hungering for as you're kind of catapulting off into a seed collection career.
You're looking at me, Georgia, like I go over, or I don't know if that was the case, but I was gullible nonetheless. Yeah, the big question. One thing that I think in terms of information that I'm hungry for, it kind of echoes back to the question of borders and boundaries in the work too. I was a little bit shy to unmute myself quickly enough, but you know, at IEE, for instance, we work within the scale of a recovery zone for something like a T&E species, and then also ecoregion, particularly the Willamette Valley, and then the coastal lowlands, as I mentioned, and that's kind of territory for assisted gene flow, or how it's conceptualized. And of course, there's many nuanced decisions within that. And then there's like the taxonomically messy is what I would say. So I'm thinking, for instance, we were collecting Eucephalus vialis this year, and Emily and I got into a conversation with Tom Kay, who's the executive director of IAE, and had done a survey of Eucephalus vialis populations within the region. And we were talking about the ways in which, and if someone's in the room and can quote me, I didn't actually get to see the Douglas County populations, but they're more glandular in the same species, but more glandular. And like, what is the border and boundary of that? There's folks in conversation already around that. And at the same point, I think it's that nuanced relationship within a species and subspecies that's really so meaningful to me when it comes to thinking about these questions of seed collection and borders and boundaries, like both in terms of the regulatory and also in terms of the deep knowledge of within a species itself. And then the other thing that I would just say is the building upon the knowledge that Georgia has shared as well, like in terms of phenology shifts within climate change, it needs to be, or I don't know needs to be, but kind of niche modeling, as George also speaks to. It's these very specific, whether it's site specific or species specific models that show us the ways in which phonology is changing, and how that, you know, that influences things like target collections. It influences so much of what we think in terms of pollinator plant relationships. And I think I hope in my time, wherever it leads me, is that there's that detailed relationship to how things are shifting. And you can see that in predictive models, and you can also see it when I'm in conversation with everyone in this room, because there's so much anecdotal knowledge that is building upon these really weighty questions that we're all speaking to.
Georgia, if you care to reflect on this, or I know you had a couple interesting questions for some other panelists, so whichever moves you.
Thanks, Cass. Yeah, well, just first more to that question of continued mentorship, I was actually really sad that I didn't get a chance to mentor with, or to have basically John mentor me before he retired. I'd gotten in touch back in like February or so of 2020, hoping to meet up with him, and then the pandemic hit, so that didn't happen. There were things like this year trying to collect Fraxinus latifolia. This is one of the things we talked about my bringing up with him, where it's out of my range. And so I made a trip to Southwest Washington, and it seemed like it was a really challenging seed year, but the trees were still in good shape, and I did get a small collection, and then went down to the Willamette Valley, and the trees were just fried. And so I was really curious, like, because it's, that's so place specific, and I didn't get to see the progression of, of what happened to that species over the course of the season. So I'd been, wanting to hear from John about that. And also, there's so much of this place specific knowledge that I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to spend more time in the Willamette Valley with you, John.
John or George, do you have any other reflections on the season for Oregon ash that you'd share regarding George's observations?
Go ahead, George.
No, you go ahead, John.
Ash is a tough one. It's if you're going to collect ash, my experience is you want to collect it where it's got its roots next to the water to have a good chance of getting viable seed from it. There's years when it will be okay in some of those trees that are away from water, but most of the time you want it where it's got its roots wet, or you're going to have empty seed. And then you got insect, and then now we got the borer coming in, and ash may disappear from the landscape before long anyway. So, yeah.
Well, that's depressing, but so true. I mean, let's get real. How many species of trees have we lost or been so severely curtailed in their distributions as a result of our kind of wanton introduction of things? It's a horrible legacy. It's a horrible legacy that we're leaving behind. Start ticking them off: white pines, elms, American chestnut, Port Orford cedar, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And that's something hopefully we can get real about, but that means we have real policy changes happening at levels that are way above our webinar today, unfortunately. Too bad we're not making these decisions, and we really should be. Actually, there are people who are attending here and people on this panel who could actually inform a sane policy regarding these kinds of global disasters. Really, there's no other way of looking at them. And wow, I don't know. I was interested in Glenn's comment about seed supply, and I think one of the things that's happening is we don't have enough people doing this work. We don't have enough boots on the ground. We also have kind of an old guard of people who are still hoping to buy a bushel of Doug fir cones for $30, and it's hard to get people to safely get up 150 feet up in a Doug fir tree and collect. That's just not realistic anymore. So we've got some cost disparities. Foresters in general are a frugal bunch. We don't want to waste money. We want to do things efficiently and get things done on the ground. We want to do it for as little as possible, but there's some realities about the costs of doing this work that I think we just haven't caught up with yet.
And you mentioned Doug fir, and there's just not as much viable seed in the cone with drought years and heat as well.
It's true. There's so much going on with all of this stuff. I was processing Sophie's question more about her comment on plant viability on outplanting, and that's true. It's huge. In the Christmas tree side, which is not most of our interest, but it's there as a huge part of the demand for conifer seed. That last year was an absolute disaster. And so absolutely 80% mortality was not at all unusual in that business. And also in reforestation at low elevations west of the Cascades, just tremendous losses in reforestation stock. And that's gonna create a spike in demand that we're not prepared to fill. We don't have a lot of buffer zone. I mean, how many years worth of seed supply do we ever have for Douglas fir? And we don't, probably not enough.
Mhm. May I ask a question or like a follow-up question of you, George, then? In terms of, I mean, you first spoke to boots on the ground and how we need more boots on the ground for seed collection. And I totally agree and understand. And at the same point, the need for kind of, how do we do that and manage for not over collection too? Like what mechanisms have you seen within the industry, even if it's just channels of communication through email that like prevent us from, or maybe I shouldn't use the word prevent, but protect the populations in which we endeavor to conserve too? Because it's the interesting both and, right? The need to get more folks out there to collect and also the need to protect and conserve those populations.
I'm really not thinking so much about the kinds of rare populations that I know you and IAE are involved in managing, and you know, so those deserve some special consideration. But you know, things like Douglas fir, things that are widely distributed. But I would also say that we're talking about paradigms that certainly deserve questioning, and I really do question our current approach to forestry and forests. What the natural forests that remain to us are the product of an awful lot of natural processes, not the least of which is natural selection. And we're curtailing that in ways that we just don't even begin to understand the implications of that curtailment. So in other words, if we're looking like at a stand of alder trees, each one of the trees in that stand that grows to maturity is the product of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of seeds, of which only one survived to become a mature adult tree. Now we're growing a tiny handful of seeds in a nursery and pampering them and making sure that they got all the resources there that they need. And we're taking that seedling and we're taking it out into the forest to achieve the same thing with just a tiny, tiny handful of seeds. We're going from millions of seeds to a tiny handful. There's something about that that's important that we need to be mindful of. If our goal is to facilitate the migration of plants in response to our own actions, then we need to be thinking about what that means exactly. How did plants get around on their own? And it's more than just seeds. And actually, Kral mentioned pollen and pollen pollution, which is a real issue, but it's also the way stuff gets around. So there's two ways plants get around, really, in large measure. It's seeds, but also pollen. And one of the things that I think we're finding in our research is, wow, pollen is really the more efficient mode of gene transfer. So when we're talking about assisted gene migration, we really better start thinking about pollen and what that means.
We knew the time would go fast, and it has. And we're going to move into closing. And as we do, I did want to note for folks, we made the slide deck have some extra slides with some questions for the audience. We really do want to hear from you, your observations, your questions. If you're game, please go into that Google deck and add your own reflections, or there's a few other categories. There's been a number of good questions in chat, and we'll try to address those that we haven't. But first, before we turn to closing, does anyone want to offer some advice on a new person that wants to get into the field of seed collection? There was a question regarding that. What advice do you have for starting off?
Yeah, I'll take that. Follow your joy. Figure out which plants attract you because you're going to be part of their future. And, my joy is diversity. I like to go to different habitats. I like to visit with different species, from the lowest overwintering herbs to the tallest trees. I also collect sequoia hair. So that's the range. But what interests you, so that you don't wind up in some cul-de-sac or dead end where you say, why am I doing this? It's sustained me now for 50 years because I followed my joy. And one other thing I would add is stewardship. So when we do wild collections, I feel that we're also responsible for the habitat that we go into. And I usually carry some clippers with me at the very least. Sometimes I spend an entire day just working on invasive species removal around the plants I want to collect. And then when I come back the next year, they're thriving. So that's part of my joy too, is, you know, making a difference in the landscape.
Nice.
I also, if I could just
Please.
jump in here on, right, I'm not muted, am I? No, okay. Jump here in here on the question of getting into the field and also just this need for more boots on the ground. I mean, I think this is really a place where we need a lot more discussion and organization. You know, we need a way to be recruiting and training seed collectors. Like we do need a bigger network. And I think somewhere, some combination of us actually just needs to make that happen. Because I mean, I guess the Forest Service probably has programs that I'm not familiar with, but you know, there's not a seed collecting degree at your local university. So, and I really think that this, you know, is an area for potential, you know, grassroots, basically development. And the other thing that I just have to plunk in here, because we haven't brought it up yet, is the issue of property access. And I guess that would have been that boundaries question. But I think this is another place where we massively need collaboration and kind of a cohesive approach to, because this part is also getting harder and harder. And so I had this just like fantasy the other night of what if there was, you know, a position, someone who was responsible for coordinating, you know, land access for collectors at a regional level. Like this, I think this is the level at which we need to be thinking, is, you know, some larger scale coordination where individual collectors don't have to figure out every single piece.
That's great, Georgia. And we are now, we knew that there'd be some heavy stuff in here, and that's really why everyone showed up. But to keep people, we wanted to end on a positive note, and we wanted to just offer a minute for each speaker to reflect on what makes you grateful for your work, or some aspect of your work that brings you contentment. John, can I start with you?
Sure. Well, I'm grateful I don't get poison oak, and that's the question. I asked somebody if they say want to collect seeds, is do you get poison oak? Because that's an issue. I will answer Sophie's question. I wanted to chime in on that, on over collecting. I think the issue is more, and this goes with what George is saying too, is protecting collecting sites from invasives taking over. And I, like Forrest, I carry clippers with me and gloves to be ripping stuff out. If we're not protecting it from the invasives, we're going to lose them that way more than we're going to lose from over collecting. And one of the things I do when I'm collecting something that's rare, those seeds, most of those are going to get eaten by insects or birds or fall to the ground and not germinate. So in a nursery conditions, if I'm collecting most of the seed, I'm giving it a better chance of growing than just leaving it there. So if I'm collecting a bulb that's kind of rare, I count as I'm collecting, and I collect 9 out of 10 seed pods, and then the 10th pod, I'm digging a hole and planting it. And I've been collecting for 15 years, and those spots, the plant's population has not diminished. So I'm not too worried about not leaving stuff, because the stuff you leave, most of it's not going to do any good anyway.
George?
I'm grateful for this opportunity to interact with people. It's one of the things that gives me real hope. And so I appreciate everybody. And I would really appreciate additional chances to speak with the other panelists when we got a minute to get together. I'd really enjoy that very much.
Great. Georgia?
Yeah, I will second what George just said, and kind of what I spoke to earlier about being sad of not getting to spend more time with John. These opportunities for collaboration feel really critical to me going forward. I don't think there's any other way forward. And in terms of being grateful for my work, I would say there's a piece for me about just getting out there and putting my hands on the plants and gathering that is just like, it's primally satisfying. And I think it would be, yeah, it would be hard to let that go. And I definitely think we're in for some tough times, but there's something about that that's just deeply meaningful, of being that involved in the ecosystem.
That's beautiful. Forrest?
I'm grateful for the freedom to choose each day. What do I want to do with seeds today? Do I want to work on seed cleaning and being a perfectionist and then making that sort of the day's goal? Or to go out into the landscape, and there's so many options where I live, you know, to be in shorelines, forests, roadsides, mountains, and just enjoy the whole spectrum of opportunity to be making a difference for the future, to be shaping the future with my actions. No energy wasted.
Kral?
Yeah, I'm really grateful for the opportunity for deep awareness, because if you don't find those seeds, you're not going to collect them. And noticing the abandoned apple orchard on the side of the roadkill deer, the owl, all kinds of goodies out there. And when you start looking all the time for everything, you notice all kinds of other stuff. Even driving at night, noticing a branch drooping down, and you turn around, put the headlights there, and it's laden with cones and just the different shapes of the trees, the colors. We find things even in the night.
Sophie?
Yeah. Quickly, I see the chat, and I just want to mention, I'm sure many know, but Seeds of Success, which is a BLM run program, is a great way to get into seed collection. They hire every year. It's seasonal, but they do a really great job of establishing protocols in order to collect seed and maintain those populations. And in terms of gratitude, gratitude to be in conversation always. It's not that always that every day. And I think that there's so much to be learned with just being in conversation and understanding and learning from others' experiences. And, that's not to be underestimated. And at the same point, I'd say something that gives me hope or excitement. I think of so we collected Kincaid's lupin this year from Eugene East Eugene. And looking at the seeds after they were cleaned from several different sites and seeing the diversity of like the speckles of teal and dusty browns and such, those to me are signals of weather, they're signals of time, they're signals of ancestry, they're signals of, biotic and abiotic factors. And these kinds of things are what like really tickle me and give me hope that, the plants are doing their thing. Yeah.
Beautiful. I want to thank Kayla and Hannah. Kayla, you've done masterful chat responses and it's hugely appreciated. And Hannah, multitasking magician. We will be reading your chat and we do appreciate your introductions to yourselves and your work and each other. And we're hearing your calls for more of different things. We'll take a look. We'll definitely organize a tea party for the speakers, hearing and your interest in connecting further. And maybe there'd be some other outcomes from that we can share. So do get in touch. We will share the recording with you all. We really welcome your ideas for additional similar or different discussions. It never can be long enough. I wish we could do this all day and maybe we should think about it, but just incredibly grateful to you all. And I think Hannah put in the chat as well, a link to the newsletter. You can sign up to receive that newsletter. It's a Treeline newsletter. There's a really lovely article coming out soon with Kral and some reflections that are new and he didn't share today. So a teaser to sign up. And just thank you again. Any other, as folks are leaving, we welcome any other comments from the speakers or other, but just tremendous thanks to you all.
Thank you, Cass.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
There was a great comment as well, a call to action to bring in more Indigenous tribal voices, perspectives, and that is a great comment and we appreciate it. We'll put in that link, Bo, and we'll send it out in follow-up email. But that is a big emphasis in the newsletter is hearing from Indigenous leaders and experts. And we're sorry that we didn't find folks for today, but we can think about that for a future gathering. I know that everyone who's a panelist here today kind of wanted that and we couldn't make it happen, unfortunately, but I'm grateful for your comment and suggestion to do that. Thank you, Kayla. There's the link if you're still there, Bo, and if not, you'll get an email. And then speakers, you're welcome to leave as you need to, but if you want, and there's anybody in the audience that wants to say, hey, please feel free to unmute and make a comment or a question, and no shade to anyone if they need to leave, speaker wise. You've given us a lot of your time and we appreciate it.
John, I was curious, you and I have been talking, getting back to the kind of direct effects of climate change on Willamette Valley plant populations in particular. And we've talked about alders. We both observed declines in red alder and other things. What do you say about salmonberry? How your salmonberry patch is holding up?
I actually talked about that when we did the practice one. I've got a spot where there's salmonberry grown underneath red alder, and both of those are in huge decline, so much that I've raised the price on both of those species. But the Rubus ursinus is winning in that situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's not like it becomes a desert when those things, nature has something ready to fill the void. And in that situation, the Rubus ursinus is as happy as can be, the dewberry. Yeah.
So that's what you're seeing really kind of coming to the, I've seen the same thing actually here right by the farm, exactly the same. It's just crawling with trailing blackberry.
Yeah, it's really happy. Yeah, actually, it's kind of interesting that I was thinking about that. Alnus rubra and rhombifolia, you got same genus, you got two rubras, and one's doing well and one's really having trouble.
You know, I think that's exactly the point, actually. When you look at these, and it could be a real key to the future. The fact that we have such a dominance of genera within which species are intercompatible. And that's the ability for these species to interact and to introgress one another could open doors for migration. That's, in fact, that sort of became the exclamation point at the very tail end of my dissertation. It's like, wow, this is what's happening. And so it is a fascinating time, and all of these observations, you know, this is our opportunity to see what happens, because we've had 10,000 years of relative climate stability. Now, all of a sudden, things are changing. So we get to see this stuff happening in real time, and that might be horrible and disastrous and scary, but it's also really cool.
George, we should put a link to your dissertation in the follow-up notes. Nadia, did you have a question or a comment to share?
Yeah, I'd just like to introduce myself. I run a program that is called Specialty Crops at Lincoln University in Missouri. It's an HBCU. And for years, we have what we call a native plants program. So now, because people like the word specialty crops, but it's mainly, we mainly work with native plants. And we focus on native edibles, but as well as other crops. And when we talk about Native Americans or indigenous people, I'm very interested in learning if there is their efforts to save the native edible, the seeds of native edibles. We have done a lot of work. We could get, I mean, we could get started anytime, but it's so much going on that I just, there's so much interest about that. And I just like to know if any of you know about that kind of effort, like a native edible seed germplasm.
Yes, locally here we have a collaboration with the, there's I believe 7 or 8 tribal entities on the Olympic Peninsula, and each one of them historically had their own prairie areas that they maintained until the early 1800s, when smallpox and other, impacts caused the decline of the prairies. So now there's a rebirth of that movement. And a lot of the prairie species were particularly desired as food plants, as medicine. And so when they begin to try to revive a prairie or start a new prairie location, the first things to go in are the camas and the other edibles, the chocolate lily, lomatium, and a lot of these are pretty heavy seed producers. So we kind of focus on that to make sure we get the best possible collections of those species so that we can jumpstart any tribal project that wants to get into edible prairie species. Of course, the woody species would be a whole different thing because the time span is much longer and the results are more enduring. But you can get from 0 to 60 on these prairie species in about 2 years in some cases. And then that fires everybody up and makes them enthusiastic to continue and expand. And I also have business relationships with almost all the tribes in Western Washington. They come to me for seeds almost every year, so I know what their needs are. And some of those are turning into reciprocal relationships now as they succeed with their projects.
I would also say that there's other tribal native plant materials programs. For instance, in the Willamette Valley, there's the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and that would be someone to reach out to with the questions too as well, to speak directly. I'm also really interested, there's a project called the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network that's working to support tribal communities in seed stewardship, and also is an advocate for different seed policy issues and the rematriation of seed. So yeah, I'm definitely someone who is equally interested in wanting to respectfully support those endeavors, and those are the two things that come to mind in terms of pointing you to people who could be the representative to speak towards.
Yeah, and we are in Missouri, so, and we do have a wonderful organization that is called Girl Native, and they actually support a nursery and seed producers. We even have a Missouri Native Seed Association. And so Missouri is really, we are really very, we are very advanced in native plants, conservation, but I would love to well, one thing in Missouri, we don't have any tribal organizations that were left in the state, but right now there is a big effort in bringing them back and working toward study more about the way it was here before. So I would follow up with the group. I'm just gonna ask if maybe in the future you have some Native Americans, as you are referring to talk to us about what some of their efforts.
Thank you.
So, and I appreciate your answers.
Great. Thanks, Nadia. Great to meet you. Anything else from anyone?
I didn't give much of an answer for what I'm grateful for. When I have my next JNS update is almost ready to send out, and it's super long with all kinds of things I'm grateful for. So you can read what I have written.
Okay, so if for anyone who doesn't know, John puts out a newsletter and it is really fun to read. And if it's okay, John, we'll put a link to that also in the follow-up notes so that new folks can subscribe if they're interested.
Okay.
All righty, thank you. Tremendous. I'm grateful for you all and for Kayla and Hannah. So thanks so much and more soon. Have a beautiful afternoon, and thanks again to everyone who's still joining us, listening in, and especially to the speakers.